Hi, everyone. We are Doctors Amanda Holbrook and Catherine Accurso. And in this presentation, we're going to explore how Spanish speakers and cultures are construed in high school Spanish textbooks. So Amanda is a high school Spanish teacher situated on Lenape territory in the eastern U.S. And I'm a language and literacies researcher on unceded Musqueam land in what's now referred to as Vancouver in Western Canada. So our paper, as you can see in the title there at the bottom of the slide, is a critical analysis of cultura in Spanish world language textbooks. So when Amanda first proposed this project, I have to say it really grew out of her observation and experience that teachers in kindergarten through grade 12 are living and teaching through a time of great social upheaval and injustice. And this is certainly true of world language teachers too. So on the one hand, her language life in part, and certainly her work, was taking place in a classroom context that she carefully constructed. And these are pictures of Amanda's classroom where you can really see that she's been very careful to honor and reflect and affirm lots of different contexts for Spanish speaking and to cultivate students' various and multiple identities as Spanish speakers and to provide a super rich and diverse collection of Spanish language literature. But on the other hand, in the larger social context, particularly in the United States, there are discourses in and about Spanish that reflect monolingual ideologies and ideologies of assimilation and that are disciplinary or punitive in nature and not disciplinary as in subject area related. These discourses sort of serve to constrain Spanish and control Spanish speakers, and they surround schools, like in the third picture here, and they're present in lots of different sectors of society, like the middle picture, which was taken at a popular restaurant in Amanda's state. And so at times like these, many teachers, and especially critically conscious ones, they're again kind of revisiting what it means to teach for social good, understanding that their students are being influenced not only by those choices in the classroom, but by all the different discourses about Spanish speakers and their cultures that are part of students' learning ecology. And so that means that Amanda and other critically minded teachers like her are reinterrogating the materials present in their classrooms, especially if they're mandated materials. And so in the context of world language education specifically, this means looking at how world language textbooks may contribute to intersectional linguistic injustice, especially in this kind of context, since the realities constructed in textbooks can influence students' ways of thinking about speakers of target languages, about cultures, about their own identities, and about their relationship to dominating language ideologies. So about 15 years ago, Deborah Herman looked into this issue in Spanish textbooks specifically, and in secondary schools specifically, which is the same context that we're focused on here. And so her 2007 paper in the journal Critical Inquiry in Language Studies, it became one of the most cited textbook analyses that you'll find on this topic. But what she argued is that Spanish textbooks at that time tended to construct small and invented worlds. And those are worlds that don't lend themselves very well to critical language teaching. So when Amanda's district adopted a brand new textbook series that claimed to teach cultura, she had some real questions about what exactly was being constructed through the language and image choices in the text. And especially since there's been some increased attention to critical language awareness in the last 15 years, she wondered, has anything changed? So accordingly, the first research question for this paper was descriptive in nature, and it was about how does the new mandated textbook series, the one that's pictured here on the slide, how does it construe Spanish speakers and cultures in its written text and visual images? Now, as well, we really wondered about to what degree the series challenged or reproduced discourses of dominance. And as I said before, that was on our minds because Spanishes in the US context have been really particularly targeted in terms of virulent public discourse, including by many political figures. And so we were really interested at getting at text context questions. And so, of course, we turned to a Hallidayan conception of language and associated theories of visual meaning making. And many in the SFL community we know have been working on applying these theories in Spanish language contexts. But to our knowledge, there wasn't a great deal yet in terms of attention to high school textbooks in the world language space in the US context. So we worked with multimodal discourse analysis here across a corpus of 24 cultura texts. And just to explain briefly what that is, this was a designated section of each chapter or textbook unit. And the authors of the textbook series describe these cultura texts as ones that present topics of high interest that highlight the products, perspectives, and practices of the unit's region or regions of focus. And so each cultura text included a main passage, 1 or 2 pop-out sections, 1 or 2 photos, and then a series of questions that was aimed at the student reader. And since there were 3 levels of text in the textbook series, the corpus is a sample of 8 texts from each level of the series, or 24 in total. And in more particular terms, for all the discourse analysts out here, this means a corpus of 11,000 or so words, 800 or so clauses, and 30 photos. So in multimodal discourse analysis, and this is parallel to any kind of analysis, we had to make some decisions about where and how to focus. And so this study unfolded in 3 phases of analysis. And the first was a register analysis of the written text there. And that evolved a framework and a process that I think will be very familiar to viewers who work with SFL discourse analysis. Amanda first did clause breaks on this corpus and then analyzed with a focus on transitivity, appraisal, and theme. And then attending to the same types of meanings, but through systems of visual choice, phase 2 was looking at a corpus of photos. And then the third phase of analysis kind of involved integrating the findings from the first 2 phases to arrive at a multimodal interpretation of the data. And here at the bottom of the slide, you can see some of the references that inspired this approach. So all in all, the method allowed for quite a deep and delicate understanding of how the authors were choosing to construct concepts like culture, roles and relationships within those cultures, and foreground or background, relatively more or less important aspects from their sort of official perspective. And what these phases of analysis really helped reveal, and Amanda's going to speak more about these findings in a moment, is that first, the textbooks semiotically backgrounded Spanish speakers as contributors to culture and tended to construct membership in a nation state as the most salient aspect of a Spanish speaker's cultural identity. Second, we discovered that Afro-descendant and indigenous members of Spanish-speaking communities were particularly backgrounded and, when present, historicized. Third, we discovered that culture was really positioned more so as a commodity than for tourist consumption. And last, that these semiotic choices served to reproduce some of the deficit ideologies around Spanish speakers and cultures present in the US context. So I'll turn it over to Amanda now.
So I'm going to highlight a few of the key findings from this analysis and their implications for language teachers and researchers like us, and maybe you too who are watching. So one of the first patterns that we noticed was that people, Spanish speakers, ostensibly the makers of cultura, were often not presented that way, agentively. Human participants tended to be grammatically and visually backgrounded, whereas objects and places were foregrounded as more fundamental to culture. You can see some examples on the slide regarding how register analysis helped bring these patterns into relief. For example, they helped us see that people were less often grammatical participants in the text or placed in theme position and less frequently judged as important. And so when we analyzed the photographs in the corpus, we found a focus on settings rather than people, long shot distances, oblique and high level angles, and so on. And this had the effect of sort of backgrounding people in the making of culture. Notice also that the reader sometimes in human places in theme position, which accounts for the remaining percentage here. So another finding that contributes to the backgrounding of Spanish speakers as agentive makers of cultura is that people were also less frequently judged than things. And when we analyzed the photographs in the corpus, we found a focus on settings rather than people. Spanish speakers are minimized through long shot distances, oblique angles, high-level angles, and the salience of objects and settings. This also had the effect of backgrounding people in the making of culture. Secondly, in the instances where people were grammatically part of cultura, we found that their nation state identities were really foregrounded, but in ways that were pretty homogenizing. So for example, Afro-descendant and indigenous populations were rarely being constructed as culture makers, and even in the few cases where others were. And so this looked like there being only one Afro-descendant participant in the corpus and indigenous participants being really sort of limited to constructors of pre-Columbian dwellings or as modern handicraft sellers. And we identified 3 times as many examples of positive judgment of Spanish speakers, primarily based on nationality, than negative judgment. And yet both Indigenous and Afro-descendants were judged negatively despite their overall lack of saliency in the texts. So in terms of dominating discourses, this is a really important pattern. The privileging of nation states and the relative erasure of Afro-descendant and Indigenous Spanish speakers, when these are, in fact, quite prominent global identities. So visually, the homogenization of people was achieved through long shot distances that construe Spanish speakers as part of a small, indistinguishable, faceless crowd. So you can see some examples on the slide here. So while technically present in slightly over half of all photos, people were salient in only about 30% of photos. So in essence, the combined effect of choices in written text and visual images construe Spanish speakers to be standardized, homogenized, and a monolithic group. And the textbook authors really miss an opportunity to explore their diverse and nuanced identities. And so the third and final point we want to highlight today relates to this idea of cultura for consumption, where the ways that culture was grammatically and visually constructed as sort of for entertainment or for tourists. So for example, as Spanish speakers themselves and their role in cultura was backgrounded, countries were foregrounded. And so that often appraised positively. Adding to this dynamic, destinations and objects of art or entertainment alone accounted for about over 30% of themes. And visually, half of all photos reflect a destination, sort of tourist destination. But then we found some other people being grammatically constructed as important participants in these places, and that would be the reader, the student who is learning Spanish. The reader accounts for nearly 30% of human participants and 7% of themes. And so the reader is really grammatically foregrounded in these ways. And visually, we found choices again like high level or eye level or oblique angles, which tended to position the reader as a detached onlooker, as well as a lack of eye contact among the people in the photos. And this suggests that what's in the picture is an offer to the looker, the student, rather than demanding something of them. And so together, these language and image choices present Spanish speakers as objects for tourist consumption, positioning the student as future tourists who need to learn Spanish to take a trip abroad as their primary motivation. So what we found in the textbook series does not appear to be an outlier because previous studies have shown Spanish textbooks at the K-12 and university levels to homogenize, simplify, and stereotype Spanish speakers and cultures, for example, such as by ignoring racial, ethnic, and economic complexity and relegating Afro-descendant and Indigenous peoples to the margins of the textbook, if they're even present at all. And so circling back to Herman's argument that Spanish textbooks construct small and invented worlds that ignore the complexity and range of identities and cultures created by Spanish speakers, we too found that the grammatical and visual evidence that is still occurring in textbooks for the same pattern. Just as Herman called for textbooks to encourage critical thinking from students and to paint a more nuanced portrait of Spanish-speaking people and cultures, our findings suggest an urgent need for teachers to incorporate countertexts to complicate the textbook's presentation of cultura as primarily tied to specific nation states, and to also bring to the forefront Spanish speakers, particularly Afro-descendant and Indigenous people, as creators of culture, and to do so in a way that students as language learners are afforded roles other than that of elite bilingual tourists and cultural consumers. And when we think about these recommendations we're making, we look forward to continuing the conversation in collaboration with others who are working in the Spanish language education space, such as Melissa Barral at Florida International University, as well as Uju Anya and other colleagues who have created a task-based open access Spanish language curriculum that centers Blackness in Latin America and Black language learners. And what they're working on is not an SFL-based curriculum, but we think it could be fruitful to sort of cross-pollinate with an expanded teaching and learning cycle, such as Meg Gebhard's proposal, or as Diana Gomez Pereira's worked on with her design of a Spanish curriculum for heritage language learners. And in teacher education, also with an SFL orientation, doctoral students like those at The Ohio State University, who are trying to prepare pre-service language teachers with those kinds of orientations. And we're thinking of Lauren Miranda here in a piece she wrote with Anna Zaitseva this year. So thank you for engaging with us today. And if you are someone who would like to be in conversation or collaboration with us, or if you have any questions or would like a list of references, please feel free to reach out. Thank you for watching.